While the 1986 patent set the general tone for Wieczorek's view of how a modern MPT should look, the 1987 patent came in and added some rocket launchers to it. The grand idea of Wieczorek's new patent was that his EBC could use the rockets carried inside the sides of the turret and hull to bombard enemy positions before being attacked by mass enemy tanks. The launchers would then remain to act as armor for the tank. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host Wood, and today I'll be covering the Wieczorek Enjeu Blindé du Combat and Enjeu Blindé du Combat Lourd main battle tank. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help is greatly appreciated. The 1987 patent followed up from the 1986 one, keeping the idea of crew pods for the men in the tank. However, citing critical voices within the army about the reduction of the tank's crews to 3 men, Wieczorek added another crew member and reshuffled all their positions. The only crew member to retain his position was the gunner, remaining on the left side of the turret. He was accompanied by the new crew member, probably placed on the right side of the turret, the observer. They would be further protected by individual armored pods, creating in effect a semi-turret position for both of them, where most of their bodies would actually be below the turret ring. The most drastic changes, however, were the placements of the driver and commander. They were moved from their initial positions into the middle of the tank, sandwiched between the turret and the engine, in their own protected capsule. It is said that the best defense is a good offense, and Wieczorek took this part to heart by fitting bombardment rockets to the sides of the turret, the sides of the hull, and the whole front. The rocket pod in the front of the hull, whether full or empty, also created a large distance from the outer armor to the crew space, forming a heavily protected frontal aspect made from composite armor with a line of sight thickness of 2 to 3 meters in places. However, this also meant that a large weight would be added to the design and mostly useless space would be present, space that could be far better used for something else. This, Wieczorek felt, would provide protection against the Soviet 125mm caliber tank guns and also guns up to 140mm caliber. Assuming the rockets were dropped as a poor idea, the basic turret shape, as outlined with these pockets, would allow for space on the sides ideal for stowage of maintenance or crew equipment, whilst keeping the outside of the tank clean and uncluttered, something important to provide the vehicle with a small radar signature to keep it well hidden. Moving vertically downwards from the shelf of the turret side was a track guard to keep mud from being thrown up onto the deck of the hull. The top run of the track then ran in the gap below this mud guard and the top of the hull side extension. The extension itself was the same width as the outer edge of the turret shelf and is clearly drawn with a double thickness of armor over the projection, providing for additional security of the ammunition which lay directly behind them. Moving down the hull side, below the extension, the hull then cut away sharply at an angle down to the belly plate, with the suspension units attached to this inward angle lower hull side. Not only would angling this lower side add an increased level of protection to direct fire, with a sloping surface and increased line of sight thickness, but it also improved the lower hull shape of the tank to provide increased protection from explosions underneath, like landmines. This vehicle was to be powered by a pair of MTU 880 V8 diesel engines combined with an automatic gearbox, with the pair of engines together making about 2,000 horsepower. At 55 tons, this would have meant an incredible 36.4 horsepower per ton. Without all of the rockets of dubious practical value, possibly saving another 5 tons, it is reasonable to estimate he could have been looking more towards 40 horsepower per ton, assuming all of the other elements remained viable. The track itself was made from steel, light metal, or composite materials, like polyester reinforced with Kevlar or glass fiber. It would be fitted with 3 rubber pads on the outside across the width, with the center pad of those 3 slightly thicker than the ones on either side. Across the top of the track run, the track would slide along the top of the hull side extensions, but was supported at each end by a single return roller. Wieczorek planned to use technology to disrupt an attacking enemy tank force from way beyond that tank force's range by using supplementary rockets. These were not to be just any old rockets, but were to be a version of the Multi-Launch Rocket System, or MLRS, able to inflict damage well beyond tank gun range. The MLRS rocket modules on the turret sides could deliver high explosive or presumably a load of anti-personnel or anti-tank mines 25 to 35 kilometers away. Wieczorek did at least hedge his bets with rockets by suggesting alternative and progressively more practical rockets instead of these. These included 120mm to 150mm rockets with a 15-kilometer range, an unspecified medium-sized rocket for ranges up to 10 kilometers, and light LL-11 40mm to 60mm caliber rockets for ranges between 3 and 6 kilometers. Each rocket pod for these LL-11 rockets would be able to hold between 15 and 20 rockets each, for a maximum of about 40 rockets total. These rockets were fitted all over the tank. The MLRS would go on the turret sides, more rockets of a larger caliber in the armored side skirts on each side, a pod of light rockets in the front hull, and more within the sides of the turret. The likelihood of such an idea ever having been adopted, even with the good parts of the designs, is extremely low, as it was just too complex. Adding another complex and heavy weapon system to a tank added nothing which a smaller investment in artillery could not accomplish. It is hard to imagine either wanting to add 6 of these 4-meter-long 300mm caliber rockets, each weighing 300 kilograms. 6 of them would mean a minimum of 1.8 tons, not including any launch pod or control equipment. Had Wieczorek dropped these ideas for at least 2 tons of unnecessary encumbrance from the MLRS rockets alone, the weight savings could have been reused elsewhere in the tank, or just left off to reduce the weight. Dropping all ideas for these rocket pods would have simplified the design, made it cheaper, and also substantially lighter. The final firepower for the tank was a dedicated anti-aircraft gun of either 30 or 40mm caliber, and a pod for surface-to-air missiles allowing for self-contained protection from enemy aircraft, including helicopters. These weapons were to be mounted in the back of the turret as they were space available, having dropped the position of the loader. Just a few years from the original filing, the world had changed enormously, with the end of the Soviet Union and the utter destruction of the Iraqi forces during the 1990-91 Gulf War, demonstrating the enormous power of the modern MBTs over those even just a little older like the T-72. Despite the T-72's autoloader and the lack of such a device on the American M1 and British Challengers, it was an incredibly one-sided fight when it came to tank versus tank combat. Even Wieczorek's consideration of substantially larger tank guns up to 140mm was not in place, and it could be argued that the British 120mm rifled gun and the German 120mm smoothbore on the American Abrams were more than adequate to deal with the Iraqi T-72s. Wieczorek once more submitted for patent. In France and Poland, his idea for an EBC. This time, however, the vehicle was larger and heavier with more suitable armament. Yet, it was clearly an evolution of his earlier work, a culmination of decades-long efforts by him to create a tank better armed and armored than anything else at the time and suitable for up to 30 years of service. In 1998, with the submission of the evolved EBC, now an EBCL, Wieczorek stuck to his ideas of protected pods for the crew, although this time all 3 crew were together and all 3 were in the hull. This would greatly aid intercommunication between the men without the need for a video link, although it was at the price of the commander being able to look out the top of the vehicle. The previous ideas of an individual crew armored pods and of placing some crew members uncomfortably between the turret and the engine were gone. In an effort to overcome the loss of awareness from detaching the crew from an elevated position, Wieczorek opted for an elevated observation periscope, which could reach between 12 and 30 meters high and fitted with a CCTV system and night vision equipment. The idea of that periscope would overcome some of that loss of situational awareness, as well as provide a significantly advantageous ability to see over obstacles or from behind cover. To increase protection for the EBC, Wieczorek proposed the use of composite armor involving multiple layers of different types of steels, light metals, ceramics, and Kevlar to provide roughly 4 times the protection available from just using traditional steel armor for the same weight. The downside of this new armor was bulk and cost. Heavy protection from use of the new armor would be arrayed across the front of the hull and a similar level of protection across the front of the turret, in modules which could easily be replaced if they became damaged. In order to provide as thick of an upper front aspect as possible, Wieczorek once more did away with the driver's hatch. Unlike the 1987 ideas of sticking the driver in the back, now all the crew were in the hull and in the front of it, so he had to come up with a method of access to and from the tank for which these men would not compromise the frontal armor. The solution was to adopt a pair of rectangular belly plates behind the front armor and under the new crew space. Additional changes to the 1986-87 concept was the use of explosive reactive armor, or ERA, on the hull, with special attention to the area between the hull and the turret for this armor. The use of bulky composite-type armor arrays provided a line-of-sight thickness of armor between 1200 and 1800 millimeters. By the time of the 1998 application, the weight had swollen faster than a cop at a donut shop. Gone was the 55-ton modest EBC, equivalent to other NATO tanks and maybe a little lighter, and incoming was this new EBC at a mammoth 120 to 150 tons instead. The 120-ton model is the EBCL-1, and the 150-ton model was the EBCL-2. At this new weight, the EBC was now an engin blindé du combat lourd, or a heavy armored combat vehicle. By 1998, the firepower, which was seen as adequate in 1987 in the form of a 120mm smoothbore, was still adequate, although the USA, UK, France, and Germany had all produced versions of a 140mm smoothbore. The existing NATO tanks were not well suited to fitting them due to size and weight considerations as well as recoil management. For example, the 120mm smoothbore, as used on the Leopard II and M1 Abrams, had a recoil force of around 80 tons, heavier than the tanks themselves. The recoil force of a 140mm gun would be even more severe, and Wieczorek saw that the solution was to effectively take his 1986 or 87 EBC concept and make it bigger and heavier to accommodate this new generation of bigger tank guns. Wieczorek postulated that his scaled-up tank design could support up to 155mm guns or even bigger, although he even seems to have sounded skeptical when he suggested 210mm as a caliber. The EBCL was also going to be using shells of at least 140mm caliber as well as surface-to-air missiles fitted in the turret rear. All of these shells and missiles would be bulky and heavy, meaning that some assistance was going to be required to replenish ammunition. Wieczorek details some assistive measures for ammunition resupply, the first of which is a dedicated resupply vehicle with a manipulator arm. This arm would take the weight of the SAM and lift it to the height of the turret, whereupon the large side armor would hinge forward, revealing a supply port in which the missile could be loaded. By having a closed-off system for the gun and ammunition to keep it apart from the crew, the vehicle gained valuable protection, but it also meant ammunition resupply by the crew would be difficult. The turret was, after all, crewless, so there would be no manual loading of shells into the turret and then passed down into the carousel. Instead, Wieczorek solved the problem and substantially reduced the burden on the crew by simply accessing the ammunition supply from the side. For the new tank, Wieczorek, somewhat confusingly, switches his ammunition types. He sticks to the discarding sabot and heat shells, but no longer are these unitary rounds. No longer, too, are they angled downwards and inwards to further reduce the width they take up. Instead, the drawings show the ammunition, once loaded into the side, being two-part with a separate propellant charge stacked on top of the ammunition part, all on a horizontal carousel. These were to be 140mm or 155mm rounds, and it is possible he was simply trying to show a semi-artillery type of gun, where the amount of propellant could be varied to vary the range, or that he was trying to simplify the design. Whichever was the case, in doing so, he also removed one of the key advantages of his own design in moving back from unitary rounds. This would lead to a shorter APF SDS penetrator, and this would drastically affect anti-armor performance. When the EBC swelled from the 55-ton range to that theoretical 120 to 150 tons, it did not just get heavier, it got larger too. Too large, in fact, to fit as a standard load on a rail car, and awkwardly large for road transport. Wieczorek did not ignore these issues and simply proposed moving the tank in separate pieces to reduce the individual load, somewhat ironically returning to one of the first problems to plague British tanks in World War I, where they were too wide to fit on rail cars and had to have the sponsons removed. The solution was perhaps less grand than might be expected. It was to simply break the vehicle down into three modules: the front crew module, the center robotic and weapons module including the turret, and the rear automotive module with the engine and transmission. The American HET, or Heavy Equipment Transport, was made by Oshkosh and consisted of the M1070 tractor and the M1000 semi-trailer unit. It provided long-range haulage on and off-road for U.S. Army equipment, including M1 Abrams MBTs. Weighing in at 18.6 tons for the tractor and 22.7 tons for the trailer, the HET had a combined unladen mass of 41.3 tons. Able to haul a maximum load of 63.5 tons, the trailer used 5 sets of quadruple wheels for a total of 20 wheels to take the load. With a haulage limit of 63.5, this would not be enough for Wieczorek's new heavier tank, but he proposed a vehicle similar to the existing in-service HET, albeit modernized and with an extra axle with 2 wheels on each side for a total of 24 tires. This was not the only change that would be needed to the HET trailer to move the EBCL. The side skirts in the turret would have to be removed at times of transport, so Wieczorek proposed a simple crane arm to be added on the front of the HET trailer. For haulage by rail, a special rail car with a lowered central portion and 2 4-axle bogies would be used, with the platform suspended between the 2 bogies like the rail car used for the Mouse. Much like the HET-type trailers for road transport, Wieczorek saw a relatively simple method for loading the tank onto both road trailers and also rail cars. For transport, 3 HET-type trailers or rail cars would be placed alongside each other and the tank loaded on from the side to straddle all 3 trailers or cars. If the 1986-87 EBC was not a sufficient step change in design for a tank, then the 1998 EBCL was a leap into a future where a military budget for a giant tank might once again exist. The designer himself, Julien Wieczorek, is a bit of an enigma, leaving a long legacy of well-thought-out and carefully considered patents on a wide variety of civil and military engineering topics. The EB from the late 90s shows a level of out-of-the-box thinking which is extravagant enough to solve that critical problem of a unitary ammunition carousel loader. It was also grounded enough that it is not hard to see it legitimately being considered at a time of the Leclerc being prototyped. The respawning in the post-Cold War of the idea is perhaps less clear in its reasoning. Certainly before, the prevailing threat to Western Europe was Soviet aggression, so considerations of tanks capable of delivering a level of firepower never before seen in a tank was somewhat understandable. Post-Cold War, such a tank would be hard to comprehend, and although the idea of strapping MLRS rockets to the sides of the turret disappeared, Wieczorek doubled down in his design in other regards. At a time when many nations were scaling back their tank fleets, with the Soviet Union now gone, Wieczorek instead planned for a tank bigger than any other in service, armed with a gun far larger too. The logistical burden of such a huge tank, whether 120 or 150 tons in weight, was answered in part by his novel ideas for transporting it on trucks and railcars and modules. Certainly the idea of an autoloading 155mm heavy main battle tank has some appeal, but in drawing it, he also sacrificed the whole point of making the carousel in the first place. With the width issue resolvable by means of module transport, such a complex system would not be needed, and why he would then choose to go back to a two-part ammunition system is pretty unclear. If width was solved by just breaking the tank into 3 parts, why not just make the tank wider and fit it normally without the extensions? There were other problems too. The periscope for visual assistance would obstruct the turret traverse, something in which could be easily resolved by putting it on the turret. The front crew access hatches reduced the frontal protection of the tank and provided access in a very awkward location, one which in a hull-down position with the hydropneumatic suspension employed would actually trap the crew. Nonetheless, Wieczorek worked hard to come up with realistic, if perhaps impractical ideas, and his goal was clear: a big, more powerful and safer tank, and a really thorough consideration of how to reload, move, and operate such a machine. None of his ideas came to fruition. The French adopted the Leclerc MBT, and no armies in the year 2000 were looking for a 120-ton, let alone 150-ton MBT. This concludes our video series on the Wieczorek Enjeu Blindé du Combat and Enjeu Blindé du Combat Lourd main battle tanks. If you liked this video, please leave a like and a subscription. You can find more information relating to these vehicles in the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.